The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. Background. Wilkie Collins was born in London in 1824, the elder son of a successful painter, William Collins. He left school at 17 and after an unhappy spell as a clerk in a tea broker's office, during which he wrote his first unpublished novel, he entered Lincoln's Inn as a law student in 1846. He considered a career as a painter, but after the publication, in 1848, of his life of his father and a novel, Antonia, in 1850, his future as a writer was assured. His meeting with Dickens in 1851 was perhaps the turning point of his career. The two became collaborators and lifelong friends. Collins contributed to Dickens's magazine, Household Words, and All the Year Round, and his two best-known novels, The Woman in White and The Moonstone, were first published in All the Year Round. Collins's private life was as complex and turbulent as his novels. He never married, but lived with a widow, Miss Caroline Graves, from 1858 until his death. He also had 3 children by a younger woman, Martha Rudd, whom he kept in a separate establishment. Collins suffered from rheumatoid gout, a form of arthritis, which made him an invalid in his later years, and he became addicted to the Latium he took to ease the pain of the illness. He died in 1889. Preface to the present edition. The Woman in White has been received with such marked favor by a very large circle of readers that this volume scarcely stands in the need of any prefatory introduction on my part. All that is necessary for me to say on the subject of the present edition, the first issued in a portable and popular form, may be summed up in a few words. I have endeavored, by careful correction and revision, to make my story as worthy as I could of a continuance of the public approval. Certain technical errors, which had escaped me while I was writing the book, are here rectified. None of these little blemishes in the slightest degree interfered with the interest of the narrative, but it was as well to remove them at the first opportunity out of respect to my readers, and these, in this edition, accordingly, they exist no more. Some doubts have been expressed in certain captious quarters about the correct presentation of the legal points incidental to the story. I may be permitted to mention that I spared no pains in this instance, as well as in others, to preserve myself from unintentionally misleading my readers. A solicitor of great experience in his profession most kindly and carefully guided my steps whenever the course of the narrative led me into the labyrinth of the law. Every doubtful question was submitted to this gentleman before I ventured on putting pen to paper, and all of the proof sheets which referred to legal matters were corrected by his hand before the story was published. I can add on high judicial authority that these precautions were not taken in vain. The law in this book has been discussed since its publication by more than one competent tribunal and has been decided to be sound. One more word before I conclude, in the acknowledgment of heavy debt of gratitude which I owe to the reading public. It is no affectation on my part to say that the success of this book has been especially welcome to me, because it implied the recognition of a literary principle which has guided me since I first addressed my readers in the character of a novelist. I have always held the old-fashioned opinion that the primary object of a work of fiction should be to tell a story. And I have never believed that the novelist who properly performed this first condition of his art was in danger on that account of neglecting the dilation of a character. For this plain reason, and the effect produced by any narrative of events is essentially dependent, not on the events themselves, but on the human interest which is directly connected with them. It is possible in novel writing to present characters successfully without telling a story, but it is not possible to tell a story successfully without presenting characters, their existence as recognizable realities being the sole condition on which the story can be effectively told. The only narrative which can hope to lay a strong hold on the attention of readers is a narrative which interests them about men and women for the perfectly obvious reason that they are men and women themselves. The reception accorded to the women in white has practically confirmed these opinions and has satisfied me that I may trust them in the future. Here is a novel which has met with very kind reception because of the story. And here is a story, the interest of which, as I know by the testimony voluntarily addressed to me of the readers themselves, is never disconnected from the interest of the character. Laura, Miss Holcombe, and Anne Catherick, Count Fosco, Mr. Fairley, and Walter Wright have made friends for me whenever they have made themselves known. I hope the time is not distant when I may meet those friends again, and when I try, through the medium of new characters, to awaken their interest in another story. Harley Street, London, 1861. The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. The First Epoch. The story begun by Walter Hartright of Clement's Inn, teacher of drawing. 1. This is the story of what a woman's patience can endure and what a man's resolution can achieve. If the machinery of the law can be depended on to fathom every case of suspicion, and to conduct every process of inquiry, with moderate assistance only from the lubricating influences of oil of gold, the events which fill these pages might have claimed their share of the public attention in a court of justice. But the law is still, in certain inevitable cases, the pre-engaged servant of the long purse, and the story is left to be told for the first time in this place. As the judge might once have heard it, so the reader shall hear it now. No circumstance of importance, from the beginning to the end of this disclosure, shall be related on hearsay evidence. When the writer of these introductory lines, Walter Hartright by name, happens to be more closely connected than others with the incidents to be recorded, he shall describe them in his own person. When his experience fails, he will retire from the position of narrator, and his task will be continued from that point on at which he has left off, by other persons who can speak to the circumstances under notice from their own knowledge just as clearly and positively as he has spoken before them. Thus the story here presented will be told by more than one pen, as the story of an offense against the laws is told in court by more than one witness, with the same object in both cases, to present the truth always in its most direct and most intelligible aspect, and to trace the course of one complete series of events by making the persons who have been most closely connected with them, at each successive stage, relate their own experience, word for word. Let Walter Hartright, teacher of drawing, aged 28 years, be heard first. 2. It was the last day of July. The long hot summer was drawing to a close, and we, the weary pilgrims of the London pavement, were beginning to think of the cloud shadows on the cornfields and the autumn breezes on the seashore. For my own poor part, the fading summer left me out of health, out of spirits, and, if the truth must be told, out of money as well. During the past year I had not managed my professional resources as carefully as usual, and my extravagance now limited me to the prospect of spending the autumn economically between my mother's cottage in Hampstead and my own chambers in town. The evening, I remember, was still and cloudy. The London air was at its heaviest. The distant hum of the street traffic was at its faintest. The small pulse of life within me and the great heart of the city around me seemed to be sinking in unison, languidly and more languidly, with the sinking sun. I roused myself from the book which I was dreaming over rather than reading, and left my chambers to meet the cool night air in the suburbs. It was one of the 2 evenings in every week which I was accustomed to spend with my mother and sister, so I turned my steps northward in the direction of Hampstead. Events which I have yet to relate make it necessary to mention in this place that my father had been dead some years at the period of which I am now writing, and that my sister, Sarah, and I were the sole survivors of a family of 5 children. My father was a drawing master before me. His exertions had made him highly successful in his profession, and his affectionate anxiety to provide for the future of those who were dependent on his labors had impelled him, from the time of his marriage, to devote to the ensuring of his life a much larger portion of his income than most consider it necessary to set aside for that purpose. Thanks to his admirable prudence and self-denial, my mother and sister were left, after his death, as independent of the world as they had been during his lifetime. I succeeded in his connection, and made every reason to feel grateful for the prospect that awaited me at my starting in life. The quiet twilight was still trembling on the topside ridges of the heath, and the view of London below me had sunk into a black gulf in the shadow of the cloudy night, when I stood before the gate of my mother's cottage. I had hardly rung the bell before the house door opened violently, and my worthy Italian friend, Professor Pesca, appeared in the servant's place, and darted out joyously to receive me, with a shrill foreign parody of an English cheer. On his own accord, and I must be allowed to add, on mine also, the professor merits the honor of a formal introduction. Accident has made him the starting point of the strange family story which is the purpose of these pages to unfold. I had first become acquainted with my Italian friend by meeting him at certain great houses, where he taught his own language and I taught drawing. All I then knew of the history of his life was that he once held a situation in the University of Padua, and that he had left Italy for political reasons, the nature of which he uniformly declined to mention to any one, and that he had been for many years respectably established in London as a teacher of languages. Without being actually a dwarf, for he was perfectly well proportioned from head to foot, Pesca was, I think, the smallest human being I ever saw out of a showroom. Remarkably anywhere by his personal appearance, he was further distinguished among the rank and file of mankind by the harmless eccentricity of his character. The ruling idea of his life appeared to be that he was bound to show his gratitude to the country which afforded him an asylum and a means of subsistence by doing his utmost to turn himself into an Englishman. Not content with paying the nation in general with the compliment of invariably carrying an umbrella and the invariably wearing gaiters and a white hat, the professor further aspired to become an Englishman in his habits and amusements, as well as his personal appearance. Finding us distinguished as a nation by our love of athletic exercises, the little man, in the innocence of his heart, devoted himself impromptu to all our English sports and pastimes, whenever he had the opportunity of joining them, firmly persuaded that he could adopt our national amusements of the field by an effort of will, precisely as he adopted our national gaiter and our national white hat. I had seen him risk his limbs blindly at a fox hunt, and in a cricket field, and soon afterwards I saw him risk his life just as blindly in the sea at Brighton. We had met there accidentally and were bathing together. If we had been engaged in any exercise peculiar to my own nation, I should have, of course, looked after Pesca carefully. But as foreigners are generally quite as well able to take care of themselves in the water as Englishmen, it never occurred to me that the art of swimming might merely add one more to the list of manly exercises which the professor believed he could learn impromptu. Soon after we had both struck out from shore, I stopped, finding my friend did not gain on me, and turned round to look for him. To my horror and amusement, I saw nothing between me and the beach but two little white arms which struggled for an instant above the surface of the water, then disappeared from view. When I dived for him, the poor little man was lying quietly coiled up at the bottom, in a hollow of a shingle, looking by many degrees smaller than I had ever seen him look before. During the few minutes that elapsed while I was taking him in, the air revived him, and he ascended the steps of the machine with my assistance. With the partial recovery of his animation came the return of his wonderful delusion on the subject of swimming. As soon as his chattering teeth would let him speak, he smiled vacantly and said that he thought it must have been the cramp. When he had thoroughly recovered himself and had joined me on the beach, his warm southern nature broke through all artificial English restraints in a moment. He overwhelmed me with the wildest expressions of affection, exclaimed passionately in an exaggerated Italian way, that he had hold his life henceforth at my disposal, and declared that he should never be happy again until he found an opportunity of proving his gratitude by rendering me some service which I might remember on my side to the end of my days. I did my best to stop the torrent of his tears and protestations by persisting in treating the whole adventure as a good subject for a joke, and succeeded at last, as I imagined, in lessening Pesca's overwhelming sense of obligation to me. Little did I think then, little did I think afterwards, when our pleasant holiday had drawn to an end, that the opportunity of serving me, for which my grateful companion so ardently longed, was soon to come, that he was eagerly to seize it on the instant, and that, by doing so, he was to turn the whole current of my existence into a new channel, and to alter me to myself almost past recognition. Yet so it was. If I had not dived for Professor Pesca when he lay under water on his shingle bed, I should, in all human probability, never have been connected with the story which these pages will relate. I should never, perhaps, have heard even the name of the woman who has lived in all my thoughts, who has possessed herself of all my energies, who has become the one guiding influence that now directs the purpose of my life. 3. Pesca's face and manner on the evening when we confronted each other at my mother's gate were more than sufficient to inform me that something extraordinary had happened. It was quite useless, however, to ask him for an immediate explanation. I could only conjecture while he was dragging me in by both hands that, knowing my habits, he had come to the cottage to make sure of meeting me that night, and that he had some news to tell of an unusually agreeable kind. We both bounced into the parlor in a highly abrupt and undignified manner. My mother sat by an open window, laughing and fanning herself. Pesca was one of her special favorites, and his wild eccentricities were always pardonable in her eyes. Poor dear soul! From the first moment when she saw and found out that little Professor was deeply and gratefully attached to her son, she opened her heart to him unreservedly, and took all his puzzling foreign peculiarities for granted, without so much as attempting to understand any of them. My sister Sarah, with all the advantages of youth, was strangely enough less pliable. She did full justice to Pesca's excellent qualities of heart, but she could not accept him implicitly as my mother accepted him for my sake. Her insular notions of propriety rose in perpetual revolt against Pesca's constitutional contempt for appearances, and she always, more or less undisguisedly, astonished at my mother's familiarity with the eccentric little foreigner. I have observed not only in my sister's case, but in the cases of others, that we of the young generation are nothing like so hardy and so impulsive as some of our elders. I constantly see old people flushed and excited by the prospect of some anticipated pleasure which altogether fails to ruffle the tranquillity of their serene grandchildren. Are we, I wonder, quite such genuine boys and girls now as our seniors were in their time? Has the great advance in education taken rather too long a stride, and are we, in these modern days, just the least trifle in the world too well brought up? Without attempting to answer those questions decisively, I may at least record that I never saw my mother and sister together in Pesca's society without finding my mother much the younger woman of the two. On this occasion, for example, while the old lady was laughing heartily over the boyish manner in which we tumbled into the parlor, Sarah was perturbedly picking up the broken pieces of a teacup which the professor had knocked off the table in his precipitate advance to meet me at the door. "I don't know what would have happened, Walter," said my mother, "if you had delayed much longer. Pesca has been half mad with impatience, and I have been half mad with curiosity. The professor has brought some wonderful news with him, in which he says you are concerned, and he has cruelly refused to give us the smallest of a hint till his friend Walter appeared. Very provoking. It spoils the set, murmured Sarah to herself, mournfully absorbed over the ruins of the broken cup. While these words were being spoken, Pesca, happily and fussily unconscious of the irreparable wrong which the crockery had suffered at his hands, was dragging a large armchair to the opposite end of the room, so as to command us all three in the character of a public speaker addressing an audience. Having turned the chair with its back toward us, he jumped into it on his knees and excitably addressed his small congregation of three from an impromptu pulpit. "Now, my good dears," began Pesca, who always said good dears when he meant worthy friends, "listen to me. The time has come. I recite my good news. I speak at last." "Hear, hear," said my mother, humoring the joke. "The next thing he'll break, mamma," whispered Sarah, "will be the back of the best armchair." "I go back into my life, and I address myself to the noblest of created beings," continued Pesca, vehemently apostrophizing my unworthy self at the top rail of the chair. "Who found me dead at the bottom of the sea through cramp? Who pulled me up to the top? And what did I say when I got into my own life and my own clothes again?" "Much more than was at all necessary," I answered as doggedly as possible, for the least encouragement in the connection with this subject invariably let loose the professor's emotion in a flood of tears. "I said," persisted Pesca, "that my life belonged to my dear friend Walter for the rest of my days, and so it does. I said I should never be happy again till I found the opportunity of doing a good something for Walter, and I've never been contented with myself till this most blessed day. Now," cried the little enthusiastic man at the top of his voice, "the overflowing happiness bursts out of me at every pore of my skin like perspiration, for on my faith and soul and honor, the something is done at last, and the only word to say now is, right, all right." It may be necessary to explain here that Pesca prided himself on being a perfect Englishman in his language as well as in his dress, manners, and amusements. Having picked up a few of our most familiar colloquial expressions, he scattered them about over his conversation whenever they happened to occur to him, turning them, in his high relish for their sound and his general ignorance of their sense, into compound words and repetitions of his own, and always running them into each other as if they consisted of one long syllable. "Among the fine London houses where I teach the language of my native country," said the professor, rushing into a long deferred explanation without another word of preference, "there is one mighty fine in the big place called Portland. You all know where that is? Yes, of course. The fine house, my good dears, has got inside a fine family, a mamma, fair and fat, three young misses, fair and fat, two young misters, fair and fat, and a papa, the fairest and the fattest of them all, who is a mighty fine merchant, up to his eyes in gold, a fair man once, but seeing that he has a naked head and two chins, fair no longer at the present time. Now mind, I teach the sublime Dante to the young misses, and ugh, my soul, bless my soul, it is not in human language to say how sublime Dante puzzles the pretty heads of all three. No matter, all in good time. The more lessons, the better for me. Now mind, imagine to yourselves that I am teaching the young misses today as usual. We are all four of us down together in the hell of Dante, at the seventh circle, but no matter for that. All the circles were alike to the young misses, fair and fat. At the seventh circle, nevertheless, my pupils were sticking fast, and I, to set them going again, recite, explain, and blow myself up red hot with useless enthusiasm, when a creak of boots in the passage outside, and in comes the golden papa, the mighty merchant with the naked head and the two chins. Ha, my good dears, I am closer than you think for to have business now. Have you been patient so far, or have you been saying to yourselves, deuce, what the deuce, Pesca is long-winded tonight? We declared that we were deeply interested, and the professor went on. In his hand, the Golden Papa has a letter, and after he has made his excuse for disturbing us in our infernal region with the common moral business of the house, he addresses himself to the three young misses, and begins, as you English begin everything in this blessed world that you have to say, with a great "Oh, oh, my dear," said the mighty merchant, "I have got a letter here from my friend Mr. The name has slipped my mind out of my mind, but no matter, we shall come back to that. Yes, yes, right, all right. So the papa says, I have a letter from my friend the mister, and he wants a recommend from me of a drawing master to go down to his house in the country. Bless my soul, bless my soul. When I heard the Golden Papa say those words, if I had been big enough to reach up to him, I should have put my arms around his neck and pressed him into my bosom in a long and grateful hug. As it was, I only bounced upon my chair, my seat on thorns, and my soul was on fire to speak, but I held my tongue and let the papa go on. Perhaps you know, says this good man of money, twiddling his friend's the letter in this way and that, in his golden fingers and thumbs. Perhaps you know, my dears, of a drawing master that I could recommend. The three young misses all look at each other and then say, with indispensable great O to the beginning, "Oh dear, no, papa, but there is Mr. Pe—" At the mention of myself I could no longer hold. The thought of you and my good dears mounts like blood to my head, and I start from my seat as if a spike had grown from the ground through the bottom of my chair. I address myself, the mighty merchant, and say, my English phrase, "Dear sir, I have a man, and the most and foremost drawing master of the world. Recommend him by post to-night, and send him off, bag and baggage." English phrase again. Ha! Send him off, bag and baggage. By the train tomorrow. Stop, 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 says Papa. Is he a foreigner or an Englishman? English to the bone of his back, I answer. Respectable? Says Papa. Sir, I say, for this last question of him outrages me, and I have been being familiar with him. Sir, the immortal fire of genius burns in this Englishman's bosom, and what it is more, his father had it before him. Never mind, says the golden barbarian of a papa. Never mind about his genius, Mr. Pesca. We don't want a genius in this country unless it is accompanied by respectability, and then we are very glad to have it, very glad indeed. Can your friend produce testimonials, letters that speak of his character? I wave my hand negligently. Letters, I say. Ha! Bless my soul, bless my soul. I should think so indeed. Volumes of letters, and portfolios of testimonies, if you like. One or two will good, says the man of money. Let him send them to me with his name and address. And stop, stop, Mr. Pesca, before you go to your friend, you better take a note. Banknote, I said indignantly. No banknote, if you please, till my brave Englishman has earned it first. Banknote, says Papa in a great surprise. Who talked of banknote? I mean a note of terms, a memorandum of what he is expected to do. Go on with your lesson, Mr. Pesca, and I will give you the necessary extract from my friend's letter. Down sits the man of merchandise and money to his pen and ink and paper. And down I go once again into the hell of Dante with my three young misses after me. In 10 minutes' time, the note is written, and the boots of Papa are creaking themselves away in the passage outside. From that moment on, my faith and soul and honor, I know nothing more. The glorious of my grateful service for my dearest friend in the world is as good as done already. Flies up into my head and makes me drunk. How I pull my young misses and myself out of the infernal region again, how my other business is done afterwards, how little bit of dinner slides down my throat, I know nothing more than a man in the moon. Enough for me, that is why I am here, with the mighty merchant's note in hand, as large as life, as hot as fire, and as happy as a king. Ha ha ha! Right, 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 all right. Here the professor waved the memorandum of his terms over his head, and ended his long voluble narrative with his shrill Italian parody of an English cheer. My mother rose the moment he had done. With flushed cheeks and brightened eyes, she caught the little man warmly by both hands. "My dear good Pesca," she said, "I never doubted your true affection for Walter, but now I am more than ever persuaded by it." "I am sure we are very much obliged to Professor Pesca for Walter's sake," added Sarah. She half rose while she spoke, as if to approach the armchair in her turn, but observing that Pesca was rapturously kissing my mother's hands, looked serious and resumed her seat. "If the familiar little man treats my mother in that way, how will he treat me?" Faces sometimes tell the truth, and that was unquestionably the thought in Sarah's mind as she sat down again. Although I myself was gratefully sensible of the kindness of Pesca's motives, my spirits were hardly so much alleviated as they ought to have been by the prospect of future employment now placed before me. When the professor had quite done with my mother's hand, and when I had warmly thanked him for his interference on my behalf, I asked to be allowed to look at the note of terms which his respectable patron had drawn up for my inspection. Pesca handed me the letter with triumphant flourish of the hand. "Read," said the little man majestically. "I promise you, my friend, the writing of the Golden Papa speaks with a tongue of trumpets for itself." The prospect which this offer of an engagement held out was certainly an attractive one. The employment was likely to be both easy and agreeable. It proposed to me at the autumn time of the year when I was least occupied, and the terms, judging by my own personal experience in my profession, were surprisingly liberal. I knew this. I knew that I ought to consider myself very fortunate if I succeeded in securing the offered employment, and yet no sooner had I read the memorandum than I felt an inexplicable willingness within me to stir in the matter. I had never, in the whole of my previous experience, found my duty and my inclination so painfully and so unaccountably at variance as I found them now. "Oh, Walter, your father never had such a chance at this," said my mother when she read the note of terms and handed it back to me. "Such distinguished people to know," remarked Sarah, straightening herself in her chair. "And on such gratifying terms of equality, too." "Yes, yes, the terms in every sense are tempting enough," I replied impatiently. "But before I send out my testimonials, I should take a little time to consider." "Consider!" explaining my mother. "Why, Walter, what is the matter with you?" "Consider!" echoed my sister. "What a very extraordinary thing to say, under the circumstances." "Consider!" chimed in the professor. "What is there to consider about? Answer me this. Have you not been complaining of your health, and have you not been longing for what you call a smack of the country breeze? Well, there in your hand is the paper that offers you the perpetual choking mouthfuls of country breeze for 4 months' time. Is that not so? Ha! Again, you want money? Well, is 4 golden guineas a week nothing? Bless my soul, only give it to me, and my boots shall creak like the golden papa's with a sense of overpowering richness of a man who walks in them. 4 guineas a week, and more than that, the charming society of 2 young misses, and more than that, your bed, your breakfast, your dinner, your gorging English teas and lunches, and drinks of foaming beer, all for nothing. Why, Walter, my dear good friend, what the deuce? For the first time in my life, I have not enough eyes in my head to look and wonder at you." Neither my mother's evident astonishment at my behavior, nor Pesca's fervid enumeration of the advantages offered to me by the new employment, had any effect in my shaking, unreasonable disinclination to go to Limmeridge House. After starting all the petty objections that I could think to going to Cumberland, and after hearing them answered, one after another, to my own complete discomfiture, I tried to set up one last obstacle by asking what was to become of my pupils in London while I was teaching Mr. Fairley's young ladies to sketch from nature. The obvious answer to this was that the greater part of them would be away on their autumn travels, and that the few who remained at home might be confided to the care of one of my brother drawing masters, whose pupils I had once taken off his hands, under similar circumstances. My sister reminded me that this gentleman had expressly placed his services at my disposal during the present season in case I wished to leave town. My mother seriously appealed to me not to let any idle caprice stand in the way of my own interests and my own health, and Pesca piteously entreated that I would not wound him to the heart by rejecting the first grateful offer of service that he had been able to make to the friend who had saved his life. The evident sincerity and affection which inspired these remonstrations would have influenced any man with an atom of good feeling in his composition. Though I could not conquer my own unaccountable perversity, I had at least virtue enough to be heartily ashamed of it, and to end the discussion pleasantly by giving way and promising to do all that was wanted of me. The rest of the evening passed merrily enough, as humorous anticipations of my coming life with the two young ladies in Cumberland. Pesca, inspired by our national grog, which appeared to get into his head in the most marvellous manner, 5 minutes after it had gone down his throat, asserted his claims to be considered a complete Englishman by making a series of speeches in rapid succession, proposing my mother's health, my sister's health, my health, and the health en masse of Mr. Fairley and the two young misses, pathologically returning thanks to himself immediately afterwards for the whole party. A secret, Walter, said my friend confidentiality as we walked home together. I am flushed by the recollection of my own eloquence. My soul bursts itself with ambition. One of these days I will go into your noble parliament. It is the dream of my whole life to be Honorable Pesca, M.P. The next morning I sent my testimonials to the professor's employer in Portland Place. 3 days passed, and I concluded with secret satisfaction that my papers had not been found sufficiently explicit. On the fourth day, however, an answer came. It announced that Mr. Fairley accepted my services and requested me to start for Cumberland immediately. All the necessary instructions for my journey were carefully and clearly added in a postscript. I made my arrangements, unwillingly enough, for leaving London early the next day. Towards evening Pesca looked in on his way to a dinner party to bid me good-bye. "I shall dry my tears in your absence," said the professor gallantly. "With this glorious thought, it is my obsequious hand that has given the first push to your fortune in the world. Go, my friend, when your sun shines in Cumberland," English proverb, "in the heaven name of the heaven, make your hay. Marry one of the two young misses. Become Honorable Hartright, M.P. And when you are at the top of the ladder, remember that Pesca at the bottom has done it all." I tried to laugh with my little friend over his parting jest, but my spirits were not to be commanded. Something jarred in me almost painfully while he was speaking in his light farewell words. I was left alone again. Nothing remained to be done but to walk to the Hampstead cottage and bid my mother and Sarah good-bye. IV. The heat had been painfully oppressive all day, and it was now a close and sultry night. My mother and sister had spoken so many last words, and begged me to wait another 5 minutes so many times, that it was nearly midnight when the servant locked the garden gate behind me. I walked forward a few paces on the shortest way back to London, then stopped and hesitated. The moon was full and broad in the dark blue starless sky, and the broken ground of the heath looked wild enough in the mysterious light to be hundreds of miles away from the great city that lay beneath it. The idea of descending any sooner than I could help into the heat and gloom of London repelled me. The prospect of going to bed in my airless chambers and the prospect of gradual suffocation seemed, in my present restless frame of mind and body, to be one and the same thing. I determined to stroll home in the purer air by the most roundabout way I could take, to follow the white, winding paths across the lonely heath, and to approach London through its most open suburb by striking into the Finchley Road, and so getting back in the cool of the new morning by the western side of the Regent's Park. I wound my way down slowly over the heath, enjoying the divine stillness of the scene, and admiring the soft alternations of light and shade as they followed each other over the broken ground on every side of me. As long as I was proceeding through this first and prettiest part of my night walk, my mind remained passively open to the impressions produced by the view, and I thought but little on any subject. Indeed, as far as my own sensations were concerned, I can hardly say that I thought at all. But when I had left the heath, and had to turn into the by-road where there was much less to see, the ideas naturally engendered by the approaching change in my habits and occupations gradually drew more and more of my attention exclusively to themselves. By the time I had arrived at the end of the road, I had become completely absorbed with my own fanciful visions of Limmeridge House, of Mr. Fairley, and of the two ladies whose practice in the art of watercolor painting I was so soon to superintend. I had now arrived at the particular point of my walk where four roads meet: the road to Hampstead, along which I had returned, the road to Finchley, the road to West End, and the road back to London. I had mechanically turned in this latter direction, and was strolling along the lonely high road, idly wondering, I remember, what the Cumberland young ladies would look like, when in a moment every drop of blood in my body was brought to a stop by a touch of a hand laid lightly and suddenly on my shoulder from behind me. I turned on the instant, with my fingers tightening round the handle of my stick. There, in the middle of the broad, bright high road, there, as if it had been that moment sprung out of the earth or dropped from the heaven, stood the figure of a solitary woman, dressed from head to foot in white garments, her head bent in a grave inquiry on mine, her hand pointing to the dark cloud over London as I faced her. I was far too seriously startled by the suddenness with which this extraordinary apparition stood before me in the dead of night, in that lonely place, to ask what she wanted. The strange woman spoke first. "Is that the road to London?" she said. I looked intently at her as she put that singular question to me. It was nearly 1 o'clock. All I could discern distinctively by the moonlight was a colorless, youthful face, meringue and sharp to look at, about the cheeks and chin, large, grave, wistfully attentive eyes, nervous, uncertain lips, and light hair of a pale brownish yellow hue. There was nothing wild, nothing immodest in her manner. It was quiet and self-controlled, a little melancholy, and a little touched by suspicion. Not exactly the manner of a lady, and at the same time not the manner of a woman in the humblest rank of life. The voice, little as I had heard yet of it, had something curiously still and mechanical in its tones, and utterance was mirac- remarkably rapid. She held a small bag in her hand, and her dress, bonnet, shawl, and gown, all white, was, as far as I could guess, certainly not composed of very delicate or expensive material. Her figure was slight and rather above average height. Her actions free from the slightest approach of extravagance. This was all that I could observe of her in the dim light, and under the perplexing, strange circumstances of our meeting. What sort of woman was she, and how she came to be out alone in the highroad an hour after midnight, I altogether failed to guess. The one thing of which I felt certain was, that the grossest of mankind could not have misconstrued her motive in speaking, even at that suspiciously late hour, and in that suspiciously lonely place. "Did you hear me?" she said, still quietly and rapidly, and without the least fretfulness or impatience. I asked if that was the way to London. "Yes," I replied, "that is the way. It leads to St. John's Wood and the Regent's Park. You must excuse my not answering you before. I was rather startled by your sudden appearance in the road, and I now am even quite unable to account for it." "You don't suspect me of doing anything wrong, do you?" "I have done nothing wrong. I have met with an accident, and I am very unfortunate in being here alone so late. Why do you suspect me of doing wrong?" She spoke with unnecessary earnestness and agitation, and shrank back from me several paces. I did my best to reassure her. "Pray, don't suppose that I have any idea of suspecting you," I said, "or any other wish than to be of assistance to you if I can. I only wondered at your appearance in the road, because it seemed to me to be empty the instant before I saw you." She turned and pointed back to the place at the junction of the road to London and the road to Hampstead, where there was a gap in the hedge. "I heard you coming," she said, "and hid in there to see what sort of man you were, before I was speaking, and doubted and feared about it until you passed, and then I obliged to steal after you and touch you." "Steal after me and touch me? Why not call to me? Strange, to say the least." "May I trust you?" she asked. "You don't You don't think the worst of me because I met with an accident?" She stopped in the confusion, shifted her bag from one hand to the other, and sighed bitterly. The loneliness and helplessness of the woman touched me. The natural impulse to assist her and spare her got the better of the judgment and the caution and the worldly tact which an older, wiser, and colder man might have summoned to help him in this strange emergency. "You may trust me for any harmless purpose," I said. "If it troubles you to explain your situation to me, don't think of returning to that subject again. I have no right to ask you for any explanations. Tell me how I can help, and if I can, I will." "You are very kind, and I am very, very thankful to have met you." The first touch of the womanly tenderness that I had heard from her trembled in her voice as she said the words, but no tears glistened in those large, wistfully attentive eyes of hers, which were still fixed on me. "I have only been in London once before," she went on more and more rapidly, "and I know nothing about that side of it yonder. Can I get a fly or a carriage of any kind? Is it too late? Oh, I don't know. If you could show me where I can get a fly, and if you will not only promise me to interfere with me, and let me leave you that when and how I please. I have a friend in London who will be glad to receive me. I want nothing else. Will you promise?" She looked anxiously up and down the road, shifted her bag again from one hand to the other, repeated the words, "Will you promise?" and looked hard in my face with a pleading fear and confusion that it troubled me to see. What could I do? Here was a stranger utterly and hopelessly at my mercy, and that stranger a forlorn woman. No house was near, no one passing whom I could consult. No earthly right existed on my part to give me the power of control over her, even if I had known how to exercise it. I traced these lines, self-distrustfully, with the shadows of after events darkening the very paper I write on, and still I say, what could I do? What I did do was to try and gain time by questioning her. "Are you sure that your friend in London will receive you at such a late hour as this?" I said. Quite sure. Only say you will let me leave you when and how I please. Only say you won't interfere with me. Will you promise?" As she repeated the words for the third time, she came close to me and laid her hand with a sudden gentle stealthiness on my bosom, a thin hand, a cold hand, when I removed it with mine, even on that sultry night. Remember that I was young. Remember that the hand which touched me was a woman's. Will you promise? Yes. One word. That little familiar word that is on everyone's lips every hour in the day. Oh, me, and I tremble now when I write it. We set our faces towards London and walked on together in the first still hour of the new day. I and this woman, whose name, whose character, whose story, whose objects in life, whose very presence by my side at that very moment were fathomless mysteries to me. It was like a dream. Was I Walter Hartright? Was this the well-known, uneventful road where holiday people strolled on Sundays? Had I really left, little more than an hour since, the quiet, decent, conventional domestic atmosphere of my mother's cottage? I was too bewildered, too conscious also of the vague sense of something like self-reproach, to speak to my strange companion for some minutes. It was her voice again that first broke the silence between us. "I want to ask you something," she said suddenly. "Do you know many people in London?" "Yes, a great many." "Many men of rank and title?" There was an unmistakable tone of suspicion in that strange question. I hesitated about answering it. "Some," I said, after a moment's silence. "Many." She came to a full stop and looked at me searching for my face. "Many men of the rank baronet?" Too much astonished to reply, I questioned her in my turn. "Why do you ask?" "Because I hope, for my own sake, that there's a baronet that you don't know." "Will you tell me his name?" "I can't. I dare not. I forget myself when I mention it." She spoke loudly and almost fiercely, raised her clutched hand in the air and shook it passionately, then, on a sudden, controlled herself again, and added, in tones lowered to a whisper, "Tell me which of them you know." I could hardly refuse to humor her in such a trifle, and I had mentioned 3 names. 2 of the names of fathers of families whose daughters I taught, one the name of a bachelor who had taken me on a cruise in his yacht to make sketches for him. "Ah! You don't know him," she said, with a sigh of relief. "Are you a man of rank and title yourself?" "Far from it. I'm only a drawing master." As the reply passed my lips, a bitterly perhaps, she took my arm with abruptness which characterized all her actions. "Not a man of rank and title?" she repeated to herself. "Thank God I may trust him." I had hitherto contrived to master my curiosity out of consideration for my companion, but it got the better of me now. "I am afraid you have a serious reason to complain of some man of rank and title," I said. "I am afraid the baronet whose name you are unwilling to mention to me has done you some grievous wrong. Is he the cause of you being out here at this strange time of night?" "Don't ask me, don't make me talk about it," she answered. "I'm not fit now. I have been cruelly used and cruelly wrong. You will be kinder than ever if you will walk on fast and not speak to me. I will sadly want to quiet myself if I can." We moved forward again in a quick pace, and for half an hour at least not a word passed on either side. From time to time, being forbidden to make any more inquiries, I stole a look at her face. It was always the same, the lips shut closed, and the brow frowning, and the eyes looking straight forward, eagerly, yet absently. We had reached the forced houses and were close on the new Westland College before she set features relaxed, and she spoke once more. "Do you live in London?" she asked. Yes, as I answered, it struck me that she might have formed some intention of appealing to me for assistance or advice, and that I might spare her a possible disappointment by warning her of my approaching absence from home. So I added, "But tomorrow I shall be away from London for some time. I'm going to the country." "Where?" she asked. "North or south?" "North, to Cumberland." "Cumberland!" She repeated the word tenderly. "Ah, I wish I was going there too. I was once happy in Cumberland." I tried again to lift the veil that hung between this woman and me. "Perhaps you were born," I said, "in the beautiful Lake Country." "No," she answered. "I was born in Hampshire, but I once went to school for a little time while in Cumberland. Lakes? I don't remember any lakes. It's Lummeridge Village and Lummeridge House should like to see again." It was my turn now to stop suddenly. In the excited state of my curiosity at that moment, the chance reference to Mr. Fairley's place of residence on her lips of my strange companion staggered me with astonishment. "Did you hear anyone calling for us?" she asked, looking up and down the road frantically the instant I stopped. "No, no, I was only struck by the name of Limmeridge House. I heard it mentioned by some Cumberland people a few days ago." "Ah, not my people. Miss Fairley is dead, and her husband is dead, and their little girl may be married and gone away by this time. I cannot say who lives at Limmeridge now. If any more are left there of that name, I only know I love them for Miss Fairley's sake." She seemed about to say more, but while she was speaking we came within a view of a turnpike at the top of Avenue Road. Her hand tightened around my arm, and she looked anxiously at the gate before us. "Is the turnpike man looking out?" she asked. He was not looking out. No one was near the place when we passed through the gate. The sight of the gas lamps in the houses seemed to agitate her and make her more impatient. "This is London," she said. "Do you see any carriages that I can get? I'm tired and frightened. I want to shut myself in and be driven away." I explained to her that we must walk a little further to get to a cab stand, unless we were fortunate enough to meet with an empty vehicle, and then tried to resume the subject of Cumberland. It was useless. That idea of shutting herself in and being driven away had now got full possession of her mind. She could think and talk of nothing else. We had hardly proceeded a third of the way down the Avenue Road when I saw a cab draw up at the house a few doors below us, and on the opposite side of the way. A gentleman got out and let himself in at the garden gate. I hailed the cab as the driver mounted the box again. When we crossed the road my companion's impatience increased to such an extent that she almost forced me to run. "It's so late," she said. "I am only in a hurry because it's so late." "I can't take you, sir, if you're not going towards Totem Court Road," said the driver civilly, when I opened the cab door. "My horse is dead beat, and I can't get him any further than the stable." "Yes, yes, that'll do for me. I'm going that way. I'm going that way," she spoke with breathless eagerness, and pressed me into the cab. I had assured myself that the man was sober as well as civil before I let her enter the vehicle, and now, when she was seated inside, I entreated her to let me see her set down safely at her destination. "No, no, no," she said vehemently. "I'm quite safe and quite happy now. If you are a gentleman, remember your promise. Let him drive on till I stop him. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you." My hand was on the cab door. She grabbed it in hers and kissed it and pushed it away. The cab drove off at the same moment. I started into the road with some vague idea of stopping again. I hardly knew why, hesitated with dread of frightening and distressing her, called at last, but not loudly enough to attract the driver's attention. the sound of the wheels growing fainter in the distance, and the cab melted into the black shadows of the night. The woman in white was gone. 10 minutes or more had passed. I was still on the same side of the way, now mechanically walking forward a few paces, then stopping again absently. At one moment I found myself doubting the reality of my own adventure. At another I was perplexed and distressed by an uneasy sense of having done wrong, which left me confusingly ignorant on how I could have done right. I had hardly knew where I was going or what I was meant to do next. I was conscious of nothing by the confusion of my own thoughts when I was abruptly recalled to myself, awakened, I might almost say, by the sound of rapidly approaching wheels close behind me. I was on the dark side of the road in the thick shadow of some garden trees when I stopped to look round. On the opposite and lighter side of the way, a short distance below me, a police officer was strolling along the direction of Regent's Park. The carriage passed me in open Chisholm, driven by two men. "Stop!" cried one. "There's a policeman. Let's ask him." The horse was instantly pulled up a few yards beyond the dark place where I stood. "Policeman!" cried the first speaker. "Have you seen a woman pass this way?" "What sort of woman, sir?" "A woman in a lavender colored gown." "No, no, no," interposed the second man. "The clothes we gave her were found on her bed. She must have gone away in the clothes she wore when she came to us. In white, policeman. A woman in white." "I haven't seen her, sir." "If you or any of your men meet with the woman, stop her and send her in careful keeping to that address. I'll pay all expenses and a fair reward into the bargain." The policeman looked at the card that was handed down to him. "Why are we to stop her, sir? What has she done?" "Done! She has escaped my asylum. Don't forget, a woman in white. Drive on."